Welcome to Mission Majjhima, Ajahn.
Ajahn.
So tell us about the Alagaddūpama Sutta, Majjhima 22.
So the discourse on the simile of the snake or the water snake is a sutta that I thought I knew well because I knew both of these similes. They're very kind of famous in the canon. And diving back in, I was astounded by how much there was to unpack that I hadn't realized. So it begins with the account of a monk named Venerable Aritta, who has come to a wrong view that those things declared to be obstructions by the Tathagata are in fact not. And the commentaries say specifically this refers to the sexual act, that he's come to the view that because householder or monastics, because householders can indulge in sexual pleasures and still come to some level of awakening, that it's therefore not, or shouldn't be a problem for monastics. And he specifically says the Tathagata, by laying down this training rule where we cannot engage in sexuality, has tried to chain the ocean, which I appreciate the phrasing of. And this is in the commentary, where the Tathagata says that comparing sort of the sensual pleasures that monastics do have, such as food, etc., to the sexual act, is comparing a mustard seed to a mountain. So just an interesting little side story from the commentaries, fleshing that out. And called by the Buddha to account for this view, the Venerable Aritta sort of gets this discourse from the Buddha, as do the monastics gathered nearby, where he first compares the teaching to a water snake, which, if grasped wrongly, will bite one and result in death or deathly suffering. Then he compares the teaching to a raft for the sake of crossing over the flood, not for grasping onto. And then he outlines these 6 ditthana, these grounds for the view of self. And it's actually a fascinating iteration, an expansion on the 5 khandhas, the aggregates of clinging, but slightly different. And from then he goes on to outline a few other points, such as just in the steady crescendo of admonitions towards letting go of that which is not yours until full awakening. And there's many nuances to draw out there, but we'll get into that in the next few minutes. Ajahn, what would you like to draw out of the sutta? What did you find interesting?
Something which the Buddha mentions here, as elsewhere, is 10 similes for sensual pleasures. And the first 7 of these are drawn out more in the Potaliya Sutta, Majjhima number 54. But the Buddha says that sensual pleasures are like a skeleton. They're like a piece of meat. They're like a grass torch. They're like a pit of coals, a dream. They're like borrowed goods. They're like a tree with fruit. They're like a butcher's knife and block, like a sword and stake, like a viper's head. And each of these are more elaborated in that Potaliya Sutta, but just really graphic similes, and the implications of those are fascinating, and to look at how we're engaging in the sense world, the world around us. Later on in the sutta, the Buddha says that one could engage in sensual pleasures without sensual desire, without perceptions of sensual desire, without thoughts of sensual desire. That is impossible. So I really appreciate the Buddha really making that explicit, because that is a very common view. We've got several of our monks' rules are specifically related to the exact wording from this sutta. Like, if a monk has the view that those things which the Buddha says obstruct one are not actually obstructions for one who engages in them, then, or if a novice does it, then we have to rebuke that monk and say, don't say that. Those things which the Buddha said obstruct one actually do obstruct one. So, this is a really clear elaboration that, an arahant, someone who's gotten to the other shore, an enlightened being, even though they have no longer any need for the raft, they're not going to go and engage in sensual pleasures. They're not just a completely, crazy wisdom ideal of, the crazy sage who can just do whatever they want. That's not the Theravada view of enlightenment, the Buddha's view of an enlightened person. So, and for yourself, Ajahn, as you said, the sutta is so big. There's so much here. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight?
The raft simile, to note that the man is gathering sticks and twigs from this side of the river, just what we have. Longta Mahabua says we sometimes think of this path as a staircase up a mountain, but actually it's more like you're kind of grabbing tufts of grass and pulling yourself up. And just the sense this isn't kind of a Tom Sawyer raft, well put together. It's a bundle of sticks that you're trying to take this personality and this life and these conditions we have, and just enough to cross over the flood. Pulling with your hands, and kicking with your feet, which I've heard compared to the four right efforts, the hands being the two of cultivating wholesome states, and the two of the feet being the letting go of unwholesome, those two iterations of each. And I think it's just you can't let go of the raft before you've crossed over either. So to note that it isn't a kind of free permission just to not hold the teaching or the vinaya with integrity, but it is an amazing simile about how to hold this and approach the teaching as a whole. What else would you like to draw out of your Ajahn?
Just a few small things. You mentioned that the teachings as a whole in this sutta, maybe for the first time in the Majjhima, we've encountered a ninefold elaboration of what the Dhamma is. The Buddha says, here is the Dhamma, the discourses, the stanzas, expositions, verses, exclamations, sayings, stories, marvels, and answers to questions. So this is an early way of categorizing the discourses and the teachings of the Buddha by, is it poetry? Is it prose? Is it given by someone else? Is it a Q&A? Is it a story of miracles? Is it a birth story, a Jataka, i.e.? It's nice that even at the time of the Buddha, there was this categorization method. Something else is just the beautiful quote, whatever is not yours, abandon it. Specifically, he's talking about the 5 hindrances and identification with the world. But it's just a great summary thing to keep in mind. Whatever is not yours, abandon it. And also, towards the end of the sutta, I believe also this might be the first time in the Majjhima where we encounter the Dhamma follower and the faith follower. So far we've encountered the 4 levels of awakening: stream entry, once return, non-return, and arhatship. But here the Buddha gives 2 more stages which are before stream entry and aren't as fixed in the sense of you've got, with stream entry, 7 more lifetimes, but with this Dhamma follower, Dhammanusari, and faith follower, Saddhanusari, your destiny is fixed, i.e. you've only got a certain number of births before you attain enlightenment. And right at the end, the Buddha says, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by me. In the Dhamma, well proclaimed, which is clear, open, evident, and free of patchwork, those who have sufficient faith in me, sufficient love for me, are all headed to heaven. So it really points to a different path than most Westerners are used to, a really faith-based practice. And I think it's not, a by faith alone kind of Christian. It has to be an intelligent faith, and that faith has to be backed up with practice of samadhi, sila, and panya, but that one can really foreground this faith. And anything else, Ajahn, that you'd like to highlight?
I think the pointing to the measure of faith being enough and affection to bring one to heaven, if obviously correctly held, it's such a sweet note for the sutta to end on. And the other thing I might just mention is it's really impressive what the Buddha does with the ditthana, the sort of standpoints of view, where he does go through letting go of the first 4 khandhas. This is not mine, this is not myself, the body, perception, etc. But consciousness, where so often there is a subtle self posited, because that's where people usually place things like the soul or an idea of a cosmic consciousness. And here the Buddha explicitly refutes that. He says, or one has the view, this experiencer of mine is eternal, the same as the universe, and will last as long as eternity. And it's a direct counter to the Upanishadic view of the world and self-Atman. And also it's a direct counter to so many of the conceptions you see in New Age circles. And basically the Buddha is saying that all these conceptions, even one like that, so rarefied, any concept like that is a standpoint of views and therefore must be relinquished. And the Dhamma is for the relinquishing of all such standpoints because the end goal is beyond them all. So it's a brilliant moment of clarity in the suttas for me.
And Ajahn, what is the word of the day?
The word of the day is ditthitthana. And that comes from the root ditti, which means view, from dis to see, and thana, which means standpoint, and that comes from the root tan or ta, which means to stand. So,
all right. Well, everyone, if you're joining in on the first Sunday that this is premiered, we'll see you over on Zoom if you can make it. And if not, we'll see you next week for Majjhima 23.